A good fundraiser always makes sure that donors have the ability to see their money at work. Fundraising is a process of building relationships, and those relationships will draw donors closer to the organization and the people it serves. Hello, this is Somaye Dehban, a network Dutchified Iranian who is on a mission to bring about financial stability for every community-based organization and initiative. I am the creator and host of Your Funding Network, a podcast for anyone who is devoted to their community and want to bring about lasting change at the local and global level. This content is based on my decade-long experience in fundraising domain, especially for development aid sector. It is also inspired by my cross-sector work in academia, politics, and the private sector. Development aid was meant as a temporary solution, and yet after decades of funding, there is no indication of sustainable change based on the interventions offered by international NGOs. In this podcast series and its dedicated newsletter, I discuss the role of community-based organizations in achieving sustainable development goals. Also, why and how we can define an exit point for development aid to collectively move towards a just and sustainable international community. Join me every third Tuesday of the month to hear how to diversify your funding resources for your local initiative and increase your self-financing for a sustainable and durable change. Now let's get together for this episode of Your Funding Network. Welcome to the fourth episode of Your Funding Network. Thank you for showing up and tuning in. This is the first episode of Your Funding Network in 2022. I'm quite excited to be back in the studio and start recording again. I've changed the format of my podcasts to make the series more coherent with each other. As you may know, beside Your Funding Network, I have 3 other podcast series, and in each of them, I address some similar issues to which I refer here in Your Funding Network. In this way, the connections between these podcast series can be more pronounced and clear. Now, with this explanation, let's get into what I have prepared for this episode. In this episode, I will be talking about understanding. Understanding is the first phase of a model that I have developed over the last couple of years in the domain of personal and organizational transformation, as well as change management, or better to say, change leadership. I presented this model last year on 30th of October, a day before my 40th birthday, at the historic academic building of Utrecht University. On my website, you can read more about this event. This model is based on over 350 books and 200 academic articles and policy papers, and I have dubbed it verbinding. Verbinding is the Dutch term for interconnectedness, but with an emotional hint towards interrelatedness. Verbinding has 3 phases: understanding, implementing, and scaling. Throughout 2022, I will present parts of this model to you in every episode. And for today's episode, I will talk about phase 1, understanding. What does it mean to understand? And why is it at the cornerstone of every action that we need and want to take in our lives? In this episode, I will talk about the necessity for understanding the context in which we raise funds, as well as the role of the consultants and solicitor. We will also talk about the new version of 80-20 rule and why and how we can apply it in our fundraising. There are many community-based organizations or small civil society organizations who spend hours and hours of their very limited time on writing proposals, which have a very limited chance of success. Not having a proper understanding of the context in which we are operating our fundraising efforts and the competition we have is a recipe for failure of a fundraising strategy. Additionally, not making a distinction between needing a consultant or staff for your fundraising efforts, or assuming that hiring a staff or a consultant is the end of your board's involvement with fundraising is a mistake and also a recipe for failure of your fundraising strategy. In this episode, together we will dig into the understanding phase of my change management model and how it can be used in fundraising. We will also go over the basic division of responsibilities in the organization when it comes to fundraising and why we need to rigorously apply the new 80-20 rule. Before we can move forward, we need to know where we are standing. And to know where we are standing, we need to look back and see where we are coming from. To build a roadmap, we need to have an in-depth understanding of the context in which we operate. And then we need to bring seemingly unlikely allies together and translate our collective vision into a step-by-step plan towards measurable impact in the domain we are working. When it comes to fundraising, I believe it is very important to know why we are raising funds and for whom. Fundraising is not just for non-for-profit organizations or civil society organizations. A lot of startups and businesses have to also raise funds. Yet, there is a very different mentality involved for each of them. For instance, take an international non-governmental organization such as CIMAVI, which is focused on health and reproductive rights of women and girls, and is based in the Netherlands. CIMAVI is based in a developed, or better to say, donor country, and it raises funds from the Dutch government through Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, or other huge foundations like Gates Foundation to offer a program to a target group in a developing country. There are also civil society organizations like COC, the Dutch LGBTQI+ rights group, which also raises funds from the Dutch government through the Ministry of Education, Culture and Science to support their target group in the Netherlands. The dynamic in fundraising between these two groups are quite different. Startups and enterprises also receive funding from governments. For instance, the Dutch government, through RVO, that is Netherlands Enterprise Agency, offers funding for the Dutch companies and enterprises to explore and expand their businesses in the Netherlands or abroad, which in return will bring prosperity for the Dutch economy. So although all these three different types of organizations are receiving funding from the Dutch government, they have very different underlying reasons for existence. When preparing our fundraising strategy that includes hiring a staff or a consultant, as well as relevant board members, we need to take these differences into account. By understanding the context of our fundraising, we can move towards designing the right team that help us achieve our fundraising goals. In the next segment, we will talk about the role of external consultants and how to pick the right one for our organization. Fundraising is a team effort that requires participation by your organization's leaders, both staff and board, as well as development staff and volunteers. In this episode, we will lay the groundwork for the future in-depth discussion of each of these roles in later episodes. Who raises funds is a multi-layered question. In this episode, we talk about the role of consultants and solicitors. And in the upcoming episodes, we will talk about the role of the board, staff, and volunteers. Fundraising, to be successful, must be a team effort. Many times, I've heard boards of directors say after deciding to hire their first director of development or other fundraising staff persons, "Whew, boy, we are glad we don't have to worry about the fundraising stuff anymore." Well, wrong. Once your organization decides to make a commitment to fundraising, everyone needs to get involved, from the board and the executive director to the development staff, to program staff, to support staff, etc. In other words, fundraising is everybody's business. Often boards feel they can bring in consultants to handle all the nasty parts of fundraising, like making the ask. This approach, like thinking the staff can do it all, is equally flawed. In fact, more so. If you decide to hire a fundraising consultant for your organization, here are the top 10 tips according to Linda Lysakovsky. Number 1. List what it is you expect the consultant to do. Have a list of expected outcomes and items to be accomplished, similar to a job description for a staff member. Number 2. Know whether you need a consultant or a staff member. Number 3. Determine whether the tasks you need to have done can be accomplished by someone internally versus an outside expert. Number 4. Determine the qualities your organization thinks are most important in a consultant. Experience with a particular type of organization, geographic location, working style, to name a few. Number 5. Research the types of consultants that are available in this specific area of expertise. Number 6. Ask other non-for-profit organizations to share their experience with similar projects. That is, if you are looking for a capital campaign consultant, talk to other non-for-profits in your community that have used the consultant for a capital campaign. Number 7, call several of the consultants on the list you have developed and determine the ones you think best meet your needs. Number 8, you may want to develop a simple request for proposals. However, be aware that many consultants do not respond to requests for proposals, particularly if they are many pages long with a lot of requirements. Number 9, schedule in-person interviews with only the consultants you're seriously considering. It will save your time and theirs. Make sure you interview the consultant with whom you will actually be working. And number 10, remember that the chemistry between your staff and board and the consultant is one of the important ingredients of a successful relationship, if not the key. One more category of professionals sometimes involved in fundraising is the solicitor. A professional solicitor, unlike a consultant, actually does ask for the money, usually through direct mail or telephone programs. I think by now I have mentioned it a few times that fundraising is a collective effort. So how do you approach fundraising to make sure everyone is involved and embraces their role? Creating a philanthropic environment is critical. Boards and staff cannot view fundraising as a necessary evil or with the tin cup mentality. Philanthropy is a huge part of most nonprofits' ability to fulfill their mission. Philanthropy is always done with the interests of the donor given top priority. Being involved in a noble profession of fundraising is rewarding because, as a fundraiser, you will see firsthand the impact donations have on the people served by your organization. And a good fundraiser always makes sure donors have the ability to see their money at work. Fundraising is a process of building relationships, and those relationships will draw donors closer to the organization and the people it serves. We will get back to this concept in future episodes again. There is a lot of competition out there for charitable fundings. To survive among your competitors, you need to ensure that you have a relevant mission and a clear vision for the future, and that you listen to your stakeholders. You also need to plan carefully for growth, often by collaborating with other nonprofits and with your community. Your staff and board must be composed of visionary leaders who monitor the financial health of your organization on a regular basis and who build a culture of philanthropy within the organization. Now, let's take a deeper look at these concepts in the next segment. Fundraising is not a necessary evil. It's not something you can do when you have time. It is also not something that just anyone can do. It is a profession and must be viewed as such. If your organization thinks it can just find a volunteer to handle the fundraising or hire someone without the skills and experience needed to be effective at fundraising, it is doomed to fail. If you think that your nonprofit deserves funding and that people who are wealthy owe it to you, you will not be successful in fundraising. As I mentioned in the previous segments, donors have many options for contributing their money, and they have no obligation to make any charitable contributions. Understanding the donor's intentions and motivation is critical. Providing good stewardship to donors is critical as well. You might need to shift your own perception of fundraising and/or that of people within your organization before you can succeed at fundraising. If your organization is merely based on the subsidy that it receives from the government and you think that is enough, then you should think again, because the moment the government subsidy is cut off, your lifeline is cut off, and you won't be able to continue your work. Some board members I worked with made the comments like, "I'll do anything for this organization except ask my friends or anyone else for money." Or, "I can't understand why foundations won't fund us. We do great work." If any of these scenarios sound familiar, these perceptions need to change in order for your organization to be successful in its fundraising. Board members must first understand your funding streams and expenses, and they need to understand and monitor the budget on a regular basis. They also need to understand the competition for funding and the reasons foundations, businesses, and individuals support the organizations they do support, and why they do not support others. You need to build awareness of your organization in the community, and you need to make a strong case of support. And your board members must be enthusiastic enough about their service on your board to want to share that enthusiasm with others, to accept a responsibility for fundraising, and to be willing to always have your organization in their minds, on their lips, and in their hearts. Board members need that fire in the belly, that passion that drives them to want your organization to succeed. 66% of lapsed donors simply think your organization does not care about them. You need to be always thinking from the donor's perspective. The rule of thumb in fundraising, previously known as 80-20% rule, which is 80% of your donations will come from 20% of your donors, has become more like 90-10, or even, as some studies have shown, 95-5. That is, 95% of donations coming from just 5% of your donors. Most organizations do not follow the 95-5 rule. In fact, they do the exact opposite. They spend 95% of their time worrying about the 95% of their donors who collectively supply about 5% of their funding. They spend countless hours working on special events that often have fewer than 100 people in attendance and do nothing to build long-term relationships with donors. They plan months in advance for a mail appeal that yields less than €1 for every euro spent and has a response rate less than 1%. And they do hours and hours of research and writing for a €5,000 grant. We will discuss in future episodes that grants, events, and direct mail all have their place in an integrated development program, but none of these alone should consume all your time. I hope these podcast series help you to work smarter, not harder, and to focus your energy on donors who have the most potential. If your organization does not have a strong culture of philanthropy, you need to start the process of changing that. Build a board and a staff that understand the importance of fundraising, the psychology of philanthropy, and the importance of investing in the development program. The 95-5 rule states that 95% of your donations will generally come from 5% of your donors. Learn how to avoid losing those high-end donors and how to build relationships that will result in low-end donors becoming major supporters of your organization. Spend 95% of your time focusing on the top 5% of your donors. With these final points, let's move to wrapping this episode. In this episode, we discussed the first phase of my organizational transformation model, which I have dubbed verbinding. This phase is called understanding and is focused on gaining a deep insight into our past, our present, and our potential future. And without knowing our past and present, it is close to impossible to imagine a future. Fundraising is a team effort. Everyone in your community-based organization must be aware of the importance of fundraising and be involved in assisting the philanthropic process. Board, staff, and volunteers must work together to enhance the fundraising process. You might at some point decide that you need a consultant to help with your fundraising. You need to know what kind of help you need before engaging a consultant or a professional solicitor. You also must be aware of the legal and ethical issues involved when you engage outside help. You also need to develop a culture of philanthropy in your organization in order to be successful. It is your job as a fundraising professional to eliminate the tin cup mentality that is often present in nonprofits. As a general rule, you should be spending 90 to 95% of your time identifying, cultivating, and soliciting those major donors who will provide 90 to 95% of your donations. In other words, face-to-face solicitations are the best way to land major gifts. The rest of your time should be spent in efforts to acquire new donors and renew and upgrade smaller donors. This can be done through phone and mail appeals. And the first step to achieve all these is understanding your own motives for existence and the context in which you're operating. We are just at the beginning of a new year, and probably most of you have set up new resolutions for yourself, your family, and your organization. I invite you to have a deep look into your level of understanding as I described in this episode. The time and energy we put into understanding our motives and needs should be seen as an investment in our organization that will pay off at a later stage. So take your time and dig deep. It is of great importance to know our motives and our context, and when we know where we are standing, we would know where we can head towards and why. And this would help us guide our next steps. Our next steps in our next purchase at the supermarket, our next step in our fundraising, our next step in setting goals, and our next opportunity to vote for a representative. What was the takeaway of this episode for you? Did you hear about something that intrigued you and encouraged you to apply it at your own community-based organization? I hope you're motivated to bring about a sustainable and durable change for your community. Want to hear more? Sign up for my thematic newsletters to get notified about each episode and more. You can do this by going to my website, somayedehban.com/newsletters. Until the next get-together, Bedrood.